Okay, so I am going to talk about my experience today with extreme weight loss, so weight cutting for sport. So in a past life prior to joining Levels, I was a national team athlete for the Canadian wrestling team. And from probably about 2005 to 2012, I competed in a number of tournaments internationally, world championships, twice medaled at the Pan American Championships, and represented Canada at a few other competitions. So unfortunately, too much experience in this area. And when I was thinking about a topic to present, I didn't want to bring up unpleasant past, but I think there's might be some interesting tie-ins to metabolic health and metabolic management. So I wanted to share my experiences, which are probably more anecdotal, a little bit of pseudoscience involved and some word of mouth techniques, but just wanted to share my experience and have some discussion around that. So in scope kind of for this discussion is sports that really have more combat-based sports that have a requirement or a weight limit in order to compete. So your wrestlings, MMAs, boxing, kickboxing, grappling, sports like that. There is some like weight management aspects to many different sports, but focus on ones with a weight requirement. Also worth calling out, some sports like horse racing and rowing also have certain weight requirements or advantages. And so athletes in those sports may also kind of engage in some of these tactics and techniques. So I'll just a quick outline of what I'll talk about. So I'll give a bit of a tail of the tape, some of the key metrics of what I was doing, trying to achieve, talk about my process, so diet and preparation, dehydration, recovery, and then how I manage the frequency and load of doing this all the time. Then some personal experience anecdotes and learnings, risks associated with doing this and some of the responses from sport governing bodies, and then open it up for Q&A and discussion. So when I competed in Olympic wrestling. So this is a little bit, some folks in the room may have competed in US wrestling in high school or college. There's a few nuances in the rules that differ between Olympic wrestling and US college wrestling. So maybe some of those will become apparent for those who have experiences as I talk through it. I weighed about 155 pounds when I was competing, though my weight kind of fluctuated between 150 and 165. And in order to compete at like a championship level, I would have to get my weight down to 132 for weigh-in. So I was consistently losing about 25 pounds over a 2-week period, recovering for 16 to 24 hours, and then having to compete full competition the next day. So process and recovery were super, super important to make sure I was at my best. So here's a quick numbers guy graph of what my weight looked like over time and kind of high level view of different phases of the process. So first phase is kind of bringing body weight within a striking distance over a couple weeks. So gradually bringing weight down. Then getting within a certain range, so 10 to 12 pounds overweight, dehydrating 10 to 12 pounds of body weight, down to a point in time weigh-in, and then recovering over the night or next day. So I'll talk about each of these phases kind of in detail and what my experience was with them. So diet and preparation was kind of a diet was a mix of very like low carb, kind of vegetable, lean meat, low fat kind of diet. So that was conventional wisdom at the time and the type of things I was eating to bring my body weight slowly down. One of the things that was important for diet at this point is we were also peaking for a competition or getting ready for a major competition. So it's really important not to crash diet or be too calorically restrictive, though there was definitely, I guess, a reduction in the overall calorie intake. So it's trying to manage those two things, weight control and preparation and also having enough energy to get my most out of workouts. Workout wise structure, so I wasn't lifting a lot of weights, needless to say. During this phase, I was mostly doing 2-a-days. In the morning I'd do some cardios, a mix of 20 to 30 to 40 minutes just run or bike with some interval cardio to get a little bit higher intensity workout in. And then training and practice at this time was, during the year we would have around 2-hour training sessions typically, which would be a mix of higher and lower intensity. Training around this time for wrestling would be higher intensity, not as long practices, so around an hour of training. And then one thing that I would do while I was preparing for this is I would teach my body to sweat after practice. So I would put on sweats after practice was finished and ride a bike like an Aerodyne or something for 30 or 40 minutes and just try to sweat as much as possible and then recover as many fluids as possible, get my water and stuff back into me. So the goal of this phase was really to get within 10 to 12 pounds overweight. And so I would be close enough to weight to dehydrate and bring my body weight down to 132 pounds. So I would typically lose about 10 to 12 pounds through dehydration and just emptying of the stomach, so mostly starvation during this phase. I'd start this about 20 hours before I needed to weigh in, and I'd usually do 2 workouts. So plan for about 5 to 6 pounds of sweat per hour in those workouts if I was properly prepared. And I would use a sauna suit to exercise in, so a plastic suit like in the picture. This is actually a picture from a 90s classic wrestling movie called Vision Quest. So some of you may recognize Matthew Modine there. And then I would do a mix of running, biking, and sauna. So I think during dehydration, you start to get a little bit dizzy as your body gets more and more dehydrated. So running when you're really close to weight or really highly dehydrated, there's a bit of a risk of injury. So passing out or falling off a treadmill. And so I'd typically start getting my sweat going with a run and then ride the bike as well, and then kind of move to a sauna when I was at more advanced stage of dehydration, just to let my body sweat. One thing we used to do in the sauna to promote sweating is use like a hotel key card or credit card to scrape sweat off the skin so that your sweat wasn't sitting on your skin and cooling you off. It probably more so gave a feeling that you were sweating a lot because you could kind of see the sweat coming off your skin than it actually helped. But that was one tactic that a lot of people used in dehydration phase. So after going through all that, recovery was super important. So only a day to get ready for competition, and after dehydrating 10 to 12 pounds of body weight, it was really important that recovery was done super well in order to prepare for competition. So I rehydrated, and I'd use I don't know if anybody's heard of Pedialyte. So it's like a concentrated electrolyte that parents give to children that maybe have diarrhea or are getting dehydrated from sickness. And so we'd use Pedialyte to help get some concentrated electrolytes in the body, some Gastrolyte as well, which is the adult version of that, but not flavored. Doesn't go down as nicely. And then just lots and lots of water. So I try to set a cadence for drinking water regularly, like a sip every 1 to 2 minutes, just to make sure I was constantly putting it back into my body. And then diet wise, I try to eat as much as I reasonably could, things that were easy on my stomach and easy to digest. So I'd eat digestive cookies, pasta without too heavy sauces, fruit and veg and other things. One of the other tactics I kind of learned to do was that I learned if I was sweating, dehydrating, eating, and then putting all this food back into my body, I would get really, really logged full of, and my stomach would get super heavy. And so I found it usually in the evening after eating dinner, I would do some exercise. So some like high intensity sprints or something. And I found that really helped with digestion. And I wake up the next morning feeling a lot better if I exercised the night before. So I would typically put on about 15 pounds over in the evening overnight of water and food. So be ready to compete the next day. And then on the exercise front, I found it was like really important to get some high intensity exercise in the day of competition as well, because I would just feel really, really crappy, really loaded down for the first 20, 30 minutes of high intensity exercise. And so I didn't want that to be part of my competition. And so I instead kind of took care of that in warm up. Okay, so that's recovery. So one of the nice things about international wrestling is I only had to do this 3 to 4 times a year. So it's not like the US college wrestling circuit or US high school wrestling where you're maybe trying to make weight every week or weekend or every other weekend. So that's a huge grind, and it really helped that I only had to do this a few times a year. At non-championship tournaments, there was a weight allowance, so about 4.5 pounds that athletes could kind of have flexibility on the scale, so that they didn't have to get down to that weight class all the time, which was a much needed or much valued respite. And then any time I wasn't at a major competition or had major stakes attached to it, I would move up in weight so that I didn't have to cut weight at all. And then I guess some personal experiences and learnings from this process. Good things so there's good and bad, mostly bad, but the good things were it really, you learn a lot about yourself, and you learn a lot about your self-discipline and areas where you might have gaps in discipline. I think the Goggins mindset of just being tough is hard and important for sport. And so I found that this helped reinforce mental toughness. I also noticed I've heard a lot of people who talk about intermittent fasting describe moments of clarity during a fast. And I found that later in my career, I was able to get a little bit of mental clarity, and I actually enjoyed going through the process because I'd use it to visualize and focus on competition. And lastly, if done well, cutting weight can be a contributor to success. So you can have a size and strength advantage over your opponents. So some of the tough lessons I learned, and maybe some funny stories. I learned that travel is really hard on you when you're doing this. So one time I competed in Thessaloniki, Greece, and in the World University Championships. And I had to take about 4 flights to get there from Saskatoon. So I flew Saskatoon, Chicago, Amsterdam, Athens, and then Thessaloniki. So I spent probably 35 hours on an airplane. My weight was really good. I was only about 15 pounds over when I left. And when I arrived, I was about 20 pounds overweight. And I only had about 2.5 days to make my weight class. And I was thirsty and hungry. So the first thing I had to do was eat and drink, which was a little bit daunting. So what ensued, I ended up making the weight, but had a really, really tough couple of days just sweating to make it down to weight that time. I learned that recovery is an important part of the process. So one of the first times I did this, I dieted on cabbage soup for a couple of weeks, and then was craving fettuccine Alfredo. So the first thing I ate after I finished was a really hearty meal of fettuccine Alfredo, and I had terrible heartburn the next day while I was competing, almost debilitating. So thankfully that competition was a 2-day tournament, and I had an easier competition on the first day, so didn't impact me too much. I found another thing I found was there's a finish line mindset with respect to dieting. So I found that I was also always dieting for this finish line and purpose, and I would pull off of discipline as soon as I finished a cycle of weight loss or weight cutting, and my weight would rebound up to a higher weight each time. So I was like constantly, maybe the first time I'd be going from 155 to 130. The next time it would be 160. The time after that, it would be 165. And so I found I lost sight of my weight equilibrium as well doing that. So it impacted my natural body weight in really odd ways. So I never really found a natural weight during this season. I was always just going up and down. I had a dehydration brain. So my fiance or my partner, Amy, can attest to this. I was really dumb when I was going through this. So I lost a number of iPad shuffles. I always seemed to misplace car keys. I think one time I weighed in and was drinking a Gatorade and putting on my hat and neglected to put the cap back on the Gatorade bottle and poured a Gatorade right over my head. So that was just a testament to like kind of how dumb you are when you're dehydrated or maybe not thinking about life in the same way. One of the other things I noticed is there's an impression on young athletes who are maybe observing this behavior from senior athletes and picking up more of a, maybe a hardcore, intense mentality of like cutting more weight is good. And I think that was a really negative impact on sport is young athletes kind of seeing this as an example and instead of maybe seeing it as a what not to do. And then one of the regrets I have is I think I spent too much time focused on weight control because all the time you're doing this in sport, you're not focused on self-improvement and learning and all the things that are actually going to make you better. It's a very consuming activity. And so it definitely took away from learning and development. Okay, a couple points on risks and rules. So this is obviously really bad for you. You don't want to do it. And there is athletes who have like damaged their health permanently or died as a result. So there was a number of wrestlers in the NCAA in the late 90s or early 2000s that died while cutting weight. And some MMA fighters have actually passed away while cutting weight. So some sport governing bodies have taken steps to limit this since the time I've experienced it as well. So the NCAA has weight certification process for their athletes. So they're only allowed to compete at certain weights. So they do hydration testing and body composition testing to do that. There's a lot of combat sports competitions have moved to weigh-ins that are the same day of competition. So a lot harder for athletes to be dehydrating like 15 pounds before they compete when they have to compete within 2 hours of weigh-in. So that's probably the single biggest impact is having to compete right after cutting weight. And then for younger athletes, sauna suits and plastic suits and saunas specifically are banned, and then implementing kind of weight allowances for non-championship events. Okay, so that was a quick run through of my past experience, but if there's any anecdotes or questions or anything anybody wants to jump in with, Q&A time.
I'll go ahead, Ryley. One, that was awesome. Thank you for sharing that. As you're well aware of, like, it resonated with me being a Iowa wrestler in high school, not at that level, but more wrestling in Iowa is like a national sport. So like it's a lot of pressure to kind of, the Iowa Hawkeyes in terms of what you're looking up at it. I played in football, I played the O-line at 185, but I wrestled at 145. So every season I was dropping 40 pounds. And it like people would just be like, I would like my, everything would collapse on me. I wasn't doing like the extreme up and down like you were, but a lot of my teammates were. I couldn't drop that much weight hydration. I would just be like gradual down.
Yeah.
And it caused me to drop out of the sport, because you're right. At the time in the early 90s, even high school wrestlers were dying when they didn't have any of the restrictions in terms of like how many weight classes you could drop or hydration tests. So it was a really kind of scary, but it was more looked at as a, how deep can you cut as a like testhood to like manlyhood, which is absolutely the wrong thing to do. So I can relate, but I'm glad that they're getting smarter about putting protections, like how many classes you can drop in a season.
Yeah. The irony of it is you go through all of this to compete against somebody who's done the exact same thing and is the exact same size as you. So it's this weird kind of arms race of self-harm that really doesn't benefit anyone. But I think it's interesting in terms of what your body is capable of, what you can recover from, and certain, impacts on your body of changing what you eat in your diet.
Totally.
Mike D.
All right. Yeah, no, right. I just kind of have a question, right? So, I wrestled when I was younger, like much younger, so I never have to worry about cutting weight. But one of my best friends, his family, it's a huge wrestling family, like multiple time Division I champs in their fam.
Yeah.
And he's like my size, like 5'10", 5'9", and would walk around at like 170, 165, but would wrestle at like 135 and 140, and I'd be around him cutting, and it was an absolutely brutal process. And like for you, and I imagine it varies, but like after weigh-ins, right, I know you start immediately to try to replenish fluids and nutrients. Like how long did it take for you to like feel like a noticeable difference to get like close to your peak? And if you had to like estimate like from 0 to 100, like oftentimes like at your peak, like where were you when you went to wrestle? I'm just
so I think there's a certain point where you just have a glass of water in your hand and you're able to drink it, that gives you a boost. So that's like 0 to 20 right away, just mental. I think so. I never had to compete immediately, like within a few hours after doing this, so I wouldn't have a great measuring stick. I think I felt fairly close to 100% by the next day, and part of that was mental, like convincing myself that I was at 100%, and I think part of it was knowing the steps I had to go through to keep things digesting and moving through my body. So I think the exercise was a really important thing for that. Like if I didn't exercise, I'd feel 60% probably. The other interesting piece about competition was there was like the competition structure for international wrestling during that time was very much like this kickboxer type thing where you like wrestle one round and then it's done, and 15 minutes later will be the next round. So the winners keep wrestling each other and the competition happens really fast. So I think that I would notice it throughout the day that maybe things weren't 100% if I wasn't recovering really well between high intensity competitions. But otherwise, like I handled it pretty well. I was fortunate that my body recovered well, and I always felt confident that I'd maybe have more stamina and be bigger and stronger than guys I was competing against.
Cool. Thank you,
Karen.
This is super cool, man. Like I've got tons of questions, but like so I've never had to cut for sports, but I've done a few extended water fasts, like from 12 was the shortest extended one to 22 days. And I found what you said about like weight equilibrium really interesting, because I noticed that as well, that my kind of bounce back weight was way higher than anything I'd ever been before. So I'm curious, like how that's played out over time. Like, have you found your equilibrium now? Or do you still kind of find that if you're not on top of it, that your weight would tend to fluctuate quite wildly if you're not kind of paying attention to that?
Yeah, so I think there was one part of that that was behavioral for me. So I was just like that finish line mentality. I was just eating crap. I was in a habit of eating crappy food when I wasn't competing. And so that probably contributed to equilibrium challenges. And I think until recently in my adult life, like after I quit wrestling, I had fairly poor eating habits. And so I had trouble. I guess I wouldn't say I've been at a healthy equilibrium since, maybe until now, because I haven't had healthy reinforcing habits. But I certainly, my weight got to a peak, and I don't know whether that was just genetic or what, but I kind of stopped at 160 to 165 pounds, and I don't fluctuate too much from that weight now.
Cool. Thanks.
Miz, is your audio fixed?
I'll try again. How does it sound?
Good.
Cool. I typed it out, but got a few +1, so maybe it's a good one to end on, I guess. What's your take on how much the weight? Let me just read the question. What's your take on whether or not you could fight better if you were fully nourished, hydrated, had a clear mind, versus reaching the weight that you need to reach? Like, could you fight better in the same weight class if you were 100% yourself? You kind of spoke to the 100% piece, but how much does this actually matter, and how much of this is optics for reaching a number that then puts you at a disadvantage?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're definitely better if you're not doing this, especially, and I think the bigger impact is more over time. So from a behavioral, taking time to learn and develop yourself, and instead of like starving and dehydrating yourself. I think the other part of that, the one challenge with international wrestling is there's only, I think there's 6 weight classes. So the gaps between them are quite large. So the next weight class up for me would have been 145. And the people I was competing against were a lot bigger and stronger than me. And so it would have taken like a commitment to get bigger and stronger to compete at that weight class. And then I would have been doing the exact same cycle, I think. So it was tough. I think that my own athletic ability and skill certainly limited my abilities. There was athletes who were just like some of the best in the world would not be cutting that much weight, and they were able to just be head and shoulders better than everybody through skill and strength and technique. So I wouldn't say, like, I definitely was a bit of a crutch Rocky style athlete myself. I would just tough it out and gut it out. And so for me, it helped, but maybe for the most skilled or like the top athletes in the world, the impact might not have been as big.
It's crazy, Steph. Impressive.
I'm sorry I haven't been keeping up with the chat, but is there anything else that came through there? Any other questions?
When you mentioned that like quite a few wrestlers have died from doing this, and what is it that's triggering that? Is it like heart attack, or is it the dehydration, or what is the kind of root cause in that cycle that's sort of triggering those sorts of adverse events?
Yeah, so I will try to answer from a very non-medical perspective, but I think it's the accumulation of stress on your body. So it's hard on your heart. Your heart is pumping a lot faster. Like, I know that in the late stages of dehydration, trying to, exercise and keep your heart rate down is really hard. So I certainly felt those stresses. And I think just the overall accumulation of not eating, dehydrating, being in a really hot environment kind of accumulates. I think a lot of the athletes who died were also riding a bike in a sauna while wearing a plastic sauna suit. So there was like accumulation of really intense factors that people were were using to lose weight that probably stressed their body out to the max. Taylor, I know you have like some experience with this. Do you have any insight from more of a medical perspective?
Yeah, I mean, when I wrestled, it was, I was way before I went to medical school, but I think, I mean, dehydration impacts you in a number of different ways, right? And it's one of the, like at the extremes, it's one of the things that folks die of, for example, following cholera, things like that. We're talking about, I think if you look at Chris and Ryley and my weight loss, you're talking about a reduction of 20 to 25% body weight. And a good portion of that is liquid. So you're reducing your blood volume, which is what causes the heart to pump faster, but that actually stays up a bit. That I think your body will try to maintain that at the expense of the extracellular fluid. So it's really your cells and the environment immediately surrounding the cells, and the interstitial fluid that we're measuring will get more intense, and it gets, I think, more difficult for things like, I think at the extremes, your muscles won't contract as well, right? Your cognitive load probably, the reason your cognitive abilities drop dramatically is because that your brain takes up the most metabolism of any organ in your body, right? So that's going to suffer first. But your muscles, I don't know how far you have to go before your muscles really suffer, but that's the arms race, is like, how much water weight can I lose without losing too much in terms of my ability to actually function. Is that kind of what you were looking for, Ryley?
It was something a little bit more technical than what I was giving, so that was great.
So Taylor, then if you're fasting like I did for like a really long period of time, but taking in a lot of fluid, how does that change the equation? Because I guess you still have like stress on the body. And actually, the first fast I did for 12 days, I actually started feeling this sort of not chest pain, but almost like heart pain. It's really hard to describe, and that's what made me stop that time. So how does it change if you're just in total calorie deficit, but you're still taking in a lot of fluid? Water, obviously.
Well, so I think, so if you were, actually, I don't think the fasting would be a big impediment. Like we've seen people exercise without eating for 15 days, 30 days.
Right. So I still did 22K on my bike every day, which was my commute at the time. I didn't do sort of hard cardio, but I did weights.
Yeah, I think what ends up happening is, I mean, from a high level, well, from a high level, you improve your aerobic fitness better when you fast and you don't eat. I think what you'll lose is, particularly if you were to wrestle without getting that weight allowance or getting that meal in, you lose the explosiveness and the ability to do anaerobic glycolysis, which enables you to like do the fast moves, to pin somebody or to throw them or to do that sort of thing. That would be the thing that you would lose first if you didn't have enough glycogen, right? And so that you could enable your muscles to function. But I think actually probably working out in a fasted state or eating less probably improves your aerobic fitness overall, would be my guess.
Interesting.
Interesting. Well, I think we're into Sean's time, so sorry for this dragging on, but thanks Taylor for the input and everyone for great questions.
Thank you.
Awesome talk, Ryley. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.